Guess you feel you'll always be.
I always had a feeling I would do a video about the Disney animated films, but never in this context. Just please don't make me talk about the Kingdom Hearts games, as I don't think my will is strong enough. So, in my determination to make sure this channel gets no views, I've decided to do something completely different again. Yep, we're talking about a board game. When I started YouTube, I never thought it would come to this, but here we are. Disney's Villainous. I don't play board games usually. In fact, I don't think I ever finished a full game of Monopoly. While I have a friend that enjoys D&D, I never had the inclination to try it. But something about this piqued my interest. Like most people on the internet, I'm sentimental over the old Disney movies, and getting to take control of the villain seems different enough to grab my attention. Yeah, in Villainous we play as the bad guy, all from a collection of different animated Disney films that spans multiple generations. From Disney's golden age with Pete or the Evil Queen, to Disney's 90s revival with villains like Ursula, Scar and Hades, right up to the modern day with Mother Gothel and Dr. Facilier. To start, we choose a shady character that comes with their own board and 2 decks of cards. The goal of the game is simple: enact the villain's plan that closely resembles their scheme from the movie. Ursula wants the trident and the crown, Hades wants Titans on Mount Olympus, Cruella wants 99 Dalmatians, strangely Gaston wants to get rid of beast tokens for some reason. Hey, I don't make the rules here. The game starts with all players drawing 4 cards from their coloured decks, and you play these cards by using power tokens gained from the locations you can land on. By drawing and playing cards each turn, you'll slowly but surely enact your devious plan and conquer your villain's goal. Each board has 4 locations that are relevant from the movie your villain was in, and each turn you'll move your piece to one of these desired locations, gaining the abilities to perform actions corresponding to the symbols located to where your piece is placed. Now that can sound a little complicated, however it's quite simple. The power token symbol has you take power from the cauldron. With an activate symbol you pay that power to use a card, such as an item or ally. With a move symbol you can move an ally or item to any adjacent location, and so on and so forth. But what's the point in ruling if there's no one to share with? So you're not alone. You and up to 5 more players play for the right of who is the most wicked of them all, each player with their own evil plans to enact. However, there can only be one, with the winner being crowned as the player who completed their victory conditions first. Here is where every character's white deck comes into play. Land on a fate symbol, and you have the option to play the fate deck against the opposing player, which I often refer to as the hero deck, because these contain the hero's items and abilities from each villain's movie, and are used against other players to hamper their foul scheme from coming to fruition. With you roadblocking other players' progression, you bolster your chance of finishing your evil scheme first. In a true villain fashion, you're as much as trying to ruin their game as complete your own. This is the linchpin the board game is built around, and how it becomes strategic and competitive. The fate and high value power token symbols are typically never at the same location, so every turn is a decision between amassing resources, playing cards to further along your goal, or playing fates to stop your opponents from achieving theirs. Playing with multiple friends will have you lying left, right and centre, stating you haven't even started to achieve your own scheme, while accusing others to have nearly finished theirs, all in an effort to get other players to fate each other and not you. You truly will become the bad guy, taking great glee in making sure your villainous friends are screwed beyond belief. Still, being fated, you're not left defenceless. By amassing your villain's allies, you'll be able to defeat heroes on your board to help your cause. Heroes and allies and items can be stacked, so the game can quickly become a real space hog. This 5-player game was pushing the family table, which we really only use for Christmas dinner, to the absolute maximum required space for the game to function. That's not to say the game isn't designed well, it's the attention to detail that justifies its price tag. Being a layabout artist in my spare time, I believe many of the villains' artwork has been slightly tweaked from their films to closely match each other better in design, making it more tangible that they're all facing each other in the same universe. Still, there's been a real effort to separate them as well. Every villain's deck and board has a solid colour, and everything is readable at a glance. Every deck has its own personal card back that caters to each villain, with the name of cards often being memorable lines from the film, so it's a treat if you're a fan, with text being big, well written and concise. Often things in the villain's reference book can sound intimidating, but when read on the card in the context of the game, can become quite simple to understand. That's not to say there's not a lot of rulebook checking, at least early on. It's one of those games, in my opinion, where you're better off just winging it for the first couple of games expecting to lose, with a more knowledgeable player telling you the mistakes you're making and eventually everything will click. I think friends and family found this much more preferable than me having to read the rulebook to them over and over again. And if you haven't been able to tell by this point in the video, you don't want me explaining anything to anyone. Swiftly moving on. The pieces are deceptively simple. To encapsulate an entire villain's mystique and design into a bit of hard plastic sounds impossible, but they managed to pull it off here. Although some pieces seem a little too delicate for my liking, I feel Isma's piece here might break in time. Also, my Queen of Hearts board had a missing power symbol. It's not a major, but still more quality assurance in the future is welcome. And although the game can take up too much space for my liking, the board and how the cards are placed on it conform to a neat, clear and compact design that expands outward slowly the further the game goes on. So the game has baseline mechanics that every villain conforms to. However, the game's headline feature is how every villain uses these rules to complete their own distinctive task. Each villain has their own unique victory condition, so every villain provides a different experience from the last. With Maleficent, you're trying to cost the land. By playing her cost cards to each location, you'll win the game. Each cost card usually has a drawback, such as Green Fire, which means if Maleficent lands on this location again, the card gets destroyed. With Scar, your goal is to defeat Mufasa. This creates a succession pile unique to Scar, which you need to get the pile to the power of 15 in order to win. Scar is tricky for opposing players, as by fating him, you can be moving him closer towards his goal. Captain Hook has you getting Peter Pan out of the Fate deck and moving him to the Jolly Roger, and when vanquished, you'll win the game. Hook summons a lot of allies and doesn't do anything overly spectacular or flashy. As such, he flies under the radar for a lot of the game. But when Pan comes out, you'll see players desperately trying to fate him into oblivion. Dr. Facilier has you discarding cards until you draw Rule New Orleans, creating his own fortune pile that has him trying to find it with the cards will tell. If you have the talisman on your side and draw the card, you win. Now he's a touch difficult to play, but I think he's one of the most fun decks in the game, as you can sum up his deck as one big gamble to randomly find a few key cards for victory. In some small ways you'll begin to reflect your villain's personality through actions performed by words printed on the card, and that's an underlying factor that will have fans enamoured with this game. Now the game is really quite simple when you think about it, with only 8 actions you can perform, and you're limited to 4 a turn with a few exceptions. You could say it's been broken down to the bare necessities. I'm sorry.
Oh boy.
This unique layer to every villain doesn't overcomplicate the game as much as you might think, and without it, the game would come off feeling bland. On that same note, because you can only perform limited actions, the actions you do take are incredibly important. So decision making is imperative. Knowing how far away you are from your goals, and recognising what your opponent needs to do to complete theirs, is vital. So without the knowledge of what your opponent can do, you might feel lost. But why the game is enjoyable from the word go, is that essentially, the game is kind of a race to the finish line. See, luck and strategy are involved, but the game really comes down to time. Every deck has an inbuilt strategy, and with enough time, will achieve its goal no matter what. So by just performing enough actions, eventually you'll win. So the game might look daunting on the surface, with every villain having their own reference book and win conditions, especially for people who don't play board games. As an example, here's an analogy of me trying to explain the game to my friends and family for the first time.
Let me show you how it works. Trust in me.
No, I can't be bothered with that. I have no time for that sort of nonsense.
But with how tightly controlled the decks and boards are, is why the game is very accessible even for first time players. This is why the Fate deck is incredibly powerful, because heroes can block symbols at any location, limiting the amount of actions other players can perform. And some villains' board starts with a locked location, which needs to be removed at some stage. Both obstacles costing you, well you guessed it, time. So it seems the player going first would have a clear advantage. So in a clever little move, before the game begins the first player doesn't have any power tokens, while the second one gains 1, and third and fourth gains 2, with 5th and 6th gaining 3. The principle behind the rule is that the first player often needs to move to a location with a power symbol so they can play cards in their hand, while other players down the chain have the option to fate straight away, since they already have tokens at their disposal. Everything up to now seems like the game is holding your hand, but I don't think that would be a fair statement. Because making the right decisions at the right time is the key for victory, this separates experienced players from the new ones. However, like any good game, the new players always have a fighting chance, and that's to do with the cleverness behind the Fate deck. Since every villain comes with their own pre-designed deck of Fate cards, every white deck is designed to counter your villain's goals, with some heroes putting villains literally back to square one. It sounds mean, because it is mean, but here nice guys finish last. This is another fun aspect of the game, where players will form short alliances to backtrack villains that get too far ahead, where you literally might have an entire table hone in on one player. Thankfully, anything past the 3-player game brings in the Fate token, which limits a person from being fated twice in a row, but that doesn't mean the whole table won't be gunning for them. So now let me address some of its shortcomings. Games can be long, and since my friends and me were trying to get the most out of the experience, we were playing with new decks every time, so there was a lot of rule checking, rereading the villain's manual, and a lot of playing cards waiting to see if anyone objects with what the card says. Now it's not a more practice won't fix, but it's something I think new players should be aware of. On the other hand, playing with 5 players meant the time between your turns was really slow. Now you need to keep a keen eye on what your opponent is doing. Often though, in the beginning at least, you and other players are just consolidating resources, power tokens, allies and the like, as you wait for the right opportunity, meaning the early turns are quite lackluster, and with more players that is just stretched out even further. On the flip side, every game eventually begins heating up, and mostly sustains that right up until the end, either you trying to fade your opponent to make sure he doesn't claim victory, or them doing the same to you. And in some cases you'll both have it won, and it's up to one last fate to decide the victor. Now I've watched and read a few reviews from board game veterans, and here's for the most part what they had to say. The boards and decks are not very dynamic. Once you play the villain, often you'll have close to an identical experience with the deck next time. Players don't interact with each other very much, and it can often feel like you're playing multiple solo games, instead of feeling like you're against each other most of the time. The villain's decks are unbalanced. Some decks require a certain card to even get started, while others are lethal from the get-go. Luck is too big of a factor in winning some decks. You can be lucky by drawing the card you need, or you'll be waiting the whole game for a card that's at the bottom of your deck. Now let me be clear, these are problems, and I ran into a few unique ones of my own. For instance, since we were trying something new every game, I found a lot of 2-player games panned out in a similar way. Either we left each other alone and only fated each other until absolutely necessary, or we fated each other until our entire boards were full at the beginning, bringing the game down to a snail's pace. Like the expert reviews had said, we ran into trouble with a few villains decks. For example, I won a game within a few turns as Maleficent, before my friend could even get his deck strategy started. Now it's nothing that fating me earlier couldn't have solved. Still, it goes to show that some villains RNG can be especially unkind to other villains decks. Still, I think a lot of these issues can be solved with a different mindset. Getting rid of your entire hand multiple times in succession runs in opposition to most card games, but here with certain villains decks, is downright essential. People tend to wait too often before fating friends, which really should be done consistently by turn 1. This fixes or at least mitigates some of the luck and interaction issues. Not entirely, but in general it helps. Getting rid of heroes off your board or pushing your villain's objectives further often require 2 different playstyles, so it brings back that variety to certain villains decks. Now all issues mentioned are still present, but they don't show up nearly as often. To start wrapping this video up, if anyone knows anything about me, you know I'm not one for shameless merchandising. But here I'd say the Disney property elevates the game. I struggle to get my head around the rules of most board games, and without having the incentive of getting to play as some of my favourite villains, I don't think I would have gave the game a chance without it. And I think that holds true for most people I introduced to the game, since the Disney brand is practically universally known, and the film's villains tend to be more charismatic and entertaining than the heroes. I found people wanted to play just so they can control their favourite villain, so it gets people over that hump of having to learn a bunch of rules. And if you're a fan of Disney, you come to the game with a baseline understanding of knowing the villain you're playing as, and having a rough idea of what he or she needs to do before you even know the rules. This gives people, I find, that little bit of confidence to try it, and thankfully when they do give it a go, the game itself is the right amount of simple and complex to make it fun over and over again. There is also Marvel Villainous that we're trying out at the moment. I haven't played it enough to really judge it, but it seems decent enough so far. If you're looking for a game to play with the family while being locked up over the holidays, I highly recommend it. And it's not a half bad gift for a Disney fan either. And there's plenty of expansions when you get tired of some of the decks. But still, they're missing one character. One very special character.
Oh, they do. I wanna be like you. I wanna walk like you, talk like you too.
Come on Disney, make my dreams come true. If you're still on the fence, Steam sells a game called Tabletop Simulator, and Villainous is a very easily downloadable mod for the game. I'm not sure how legal it is, but I find games without much effort, so it's a great way to test the game out for yourself, if you're unsure. So I guess we're talking about board games these days. Who knew, huh? Anyway, this has been Jamie on Disney Villainous, and if you made it this far into the video, I want to thank you for watching.